Masechet Pesachim, Daf Lamed Zayin. We're going to be speaking about a variety of baking methods that are not standard, and see do they fall into the category of chametz and masa, related also to Halah. Halah, taking halat and giving to the kohen, is only required for something that is called bread. So we'll relate all of these definitions. So three items on the agenda. One, a very thick masa. Is that permitted? Second, if you make shapes out of the matzah, like animal shapes, dinosaur shapes, like the chicken nuggets, can you do that with your matzah dough? And third, taking challah from pan-fried. How about pan-fried bread, kind of like donuts or bagels? What's that status? All right, so let's start with the first one regarding thick matzah. We have a baraita. Tano Rabbanan and ofin pat ava b'Pesach dibre bet Shammai ubet Hillel matirin. Okay, as usual, bet Hillel is more lenient, and so this thick bread should not be made on Pesach. In the printed editions, it has the words biyom tov in parentheses. So let's see, what do the manuscripts tell us about this? Here we go. The first printing, which is one in Venice in 1520, did have the words biyom tov, and so that was copied in future printings. But in the Vilna, they realized that these words are problematic, and so didn't want to erase them altogether, put them in parentheses, don't read them. That was a good thing to do, because if you see the manuscripts, including the Ashkenazi, Sephardi, Yemenite, Geniza fragments, nobody has these words Yom Tov. So we should not read these words. In fact, if you read these words, the Gemara will not make sense. The word Yom Tov is actually anticipating the answer that we'll see in a minute. Okay, anyway, you should not make thick masa on Pesach, according to Bet Shammai, presumably because when it's thick, it's more likely to rise. It's hard to keep control of it. But Bet Hillel says it's fine. Now, what is the definition of thick masa? Bechama pat ava, amar Rav Huna tefah, sheken masinu belechem apanim, tefah. Lechem apanim, that's the 12 showbreads that they would put in the Bet HaMikdash and change them out from week to week. Even though they're called lechem apanim, they actually were made out of masa. In general, you cannot have leavened bread in the Bet HaMikdash. Masa is an all year round law when it comes to Bet HaMikdash categories. And in a way, on Pesach, we're making our homes holy like a sanctuary by removing all the chametz. So you'd have these loaves. How thick were the loaves of the showbread? They're called lechem apanim. Gemara in Sukkah says that lechem has panim, it has to have a face. So when you're seeing it from the side, if it's very thin, you won't see anything. So what's the smallest that you can say is called a face? A tefah. So therefore, those were tefah thick, and they were not chametz. So there you go. That's a proof that for Bet Hillel that you're allowed to make it even up to a tefah thick, and that would still be all right. Okay, that's Rav Huna's opinion. However, Rav Yosef says that's impossible. Matkif la Rav Yosef. Im amru bezirizin, yomru beshenan zirizin. Fine, in the Bet HaMikdash, when it's the Kohanim making the showbread under supervision, they can be very careful to make sure that that thick bread will not rise and remain masa. But are you going to say that that's a halacha for everybody in their own homes, that they can make thick bread? They're not going to be so careful. It's very difficult to do. We saw this argument yesterday. But Rav Yosef doesn't stop there. He adds 4 more arguments. Im amru bepat amela, yomeru bepat she'eno amela. If you say this regarding to dough that's kneaded very well in the Bet HaMikdash, they describe how the menachot, the things that they would prepare, had to be kneaded 300 times and pounded 500 times, and while it's kneading, it doesn't rise. So these are very high requirements that are required in the Bet HaMikdash, and people in their homes are not going to do that. Furthermore, in the Bet HaMikdash, they would make sure that all the wood that they used to fire the ovens there was dry wood. They collected it in the summer when it was warm and dry out, and dry wood burns hotter. Whereas people in their homes, they get wood more recently, and the wood is still damp and doesn't burn as hot. and so therefore, that will more likely to become chametz at home. In the Bet Hamikdash, they're baking all the time. Everybody's constantly bringing different menachot and things that they have to bake, so the oven's hot and therefore will not rise. Whereas at home, you're just preheating the oven; it's not so hot yet, and that will more likely give time for it to rise. Furthermore, most people in their homes, they have clay ovens, which don't get as hot. Whereas in Bet HaMikdash, they have a metal oven. Probably makes sense because a clay oven, if it becomes tameh, you got to break it. Whereas one that's made out of metal, you can kosher it. So in the Bet HaMikdash, you want to have it out of metal so that they can keep it continually tahor, not kosher too. Okay, good. So for all those reasons, Rav Yosef says, no, it does not make sense. We cannot accept that people in their homes would be allowed to make a thick masa. It's too dangerous. So therefore, thick masas are out. This would explain why masas are all very thin. Instead, we have a second interpretation of what this ava means. Amar Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba, she'ilit et Rabbi biyichud, umanu Rav. He says, I asked my rabbi in particular about this. Yichud has different interpretations. Some say it means I asked my special rabbi, or I asked him in private. I think it makes more sense to say I asked him exactly about this thing. My rabbi, who was Rav Yirmiyah's rabbi? Rav, the first generation Amoran Bavel. That was his rabbi. Another version of this attribution, all this is the same, except the identification of his rabbi is not Rav, but rather the Biyuda Han-Nasi. I think the first one makes more sense. That Rav was in fact his rabbi. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was Rav's teacher, and maybe this comes from an understanding of the word Rabbi. Rabbi standard alone means Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, but in this case he means Rabbi as my rabbi, and that was Rav. All right. In any case, whoever said this, the question was, "My pat ava." What does it mean when you say thick bread that Bet Hillel says is permitted? Pat miruba, it means a lot of bread, making a big dough and making a lot of bread at the same time. Each one of them is going to be thin. It's not talking about the thickness, but rather the quantity. Okay, pat ava, that's a strange thing to call that thick bread. Mishum de nefisha belisha. Well, it is because the dough is thick, and so you're going to have to do a lot of kneading. So that's why it's called thick. Or maybe that's just the language in their place that they would call, when you have a lot of bread, they call it thick bread. Okay. Now, anyway, what's the problem with making a big batch at the same time? So perhaps you say it's because you're exerting yourself a lot on Yom Tov, Pesach, but also every Yom Tov. You're allowed to cook for the day, but you can't do a big exertion. So you can't cook more than you need or do things that are going to be very exhausting. And so if you're making a lot of bread, that's the problem. But that doesn't fit so well, because we said on Pesach, right? If you remember, Enofin patava ba Pesach, where the words Yom Tov were not there in this baraita. So why would it say on Pesach? It sounds like it's a Pesach problem, not a Yom Tov problem. So we answer, inachiname, you're right. This law applies not only to Pesach, it applies to any Yom Tov. You should not make a lot of bread. According to Bet Shammai, you cannot. According to Bet Hillel, it's fine. So Tana b'Yom Tov shel Pesach ka'eh. This Tana happened to be talking about Pesach because it was Pesach time. But we have the same baraita regarding other holidays. Tanya nemehachi Bet Shammai omrim enofin pat ava b'Yom Tov uBet Hillel matirin. So here's a parallel baraita that talks about b'Yom Tov. Okay, see this word b'Yom Tov somehow crept into the previous one by mistake, but it's clear that the previous one was talking about Pesach only, and this is more broad. Okay, so what is the reason for Bet Hillel here? Bet Shammai has a good reason. You shouldn't exert yourself and cook things that you're not even going to need. It seems that Bet Hillel's reason is that when you cook bread in an oven, when you fill the oven with bread, it comes out better, it's tastier. And so therefore, for the benefit of Yom Tov, it is permitted to bake a lot of bread because even though you're not going to eat all of them, it'll be tastier. And so that's good for this Yom Tov. Bet Shammai says no. All right. So that's the first topic here, which was thick matzah. We saw that one opinion says it means even a tefah thick, and then we rejected that. So halacha l'maaseh, you're not allowed to make thick bread. And then the second halacha was making a large batch of bread, and that was not a Pesach law, but rather a Yom Tov law. Okay, now we're going to be talking about shaping the matzah, like you make cookies with a cookie cutter, or make them different shapes, or halot. You can make them all different shapes. Are you allowed to make different shapes with your matzah? Tenor Rabbanan, yosein bepat nikiya ubahadra'a ubesrikin hamesuyarin ba pesach. You are allowed to make matzah and use it for the seder, where you can use fine bread, pat nikiya hadra, coarse bread, and sirikin mesuyarin, shapes that are designed shapes on Pesach. Even though they said you should not make them. In other words, you should not make shaped masot. If you did already, they are kosher and you can use them for the mitzvah. Okay, so that's the baraita. Now let's analyze it. Amar Rav Yehuda, davar zeh sha'al baitos ben zonin lachachamim. This matter was asked by Baitos ben Zonin. Zonin is the Hebrew version of Zeno. So these were bakers, famous bakers. So they came and asked the sages, why not? They wanted to make them. They can sell them at a higher price, right? And so they said, what's the problem? Because when a woman is baking them, she's going to take her knife and make designs and spend a long time perfecting these designs, and so during that time it's going to become leaven. You got to do it quickly, make matzah quickly. You can't waste time making designs. Okay, so that seems to be a good reason. But the bakers have a counter argument. Oh, well, you don't have to do it by hand. You could use a mold. Just use a cookie cutter. It only takes 1 second, and then you can do it immediately, and it will not delay the baking process. So what's the problem? What? Then people are going to say all shaped bread is not allowed except for yours, except for the one from the Baitos bakery. We can't do that. We can't. It's a lo pelug. We're not going to make a distinction and say these are okay, those are not okay. You can't make a law that says if you use a cookie cutter it's okay, but not if don't use a cookie cutter. We got to protect everyone and make a blanket law, and therefore across the board nobody is allowed to make shaped masot. But the avad could be it's okay. All right, so they weren't able to make a profit off of the shaped bread. Now we have a story about this. Amar Rabbi Elazar bar Sadok. Pamachat nichnasti achar Abba lebet Rabban Gamliel. So Rabbi Elazar went with his father to the house of Rabban Gamliel, the Nasi. He's very fancy. He's going to have a lot of fancy food. It was Passover, and he brought shaped masot. Amarti, Abba, lo kach amru chachamim, en osin sirikina mesuirin bapesach. So the son says, Dad, how could they do this? The rabbis in the Braita said, you're not allowed to have shaped bread, shaped basot. Amali beni, lo shel kol adam amiru, ela shenachtomin amiru. No, they didn't make that law across the board. They only said that bakers cannot. But people at home can. Why? What's the difference? Bakers are making it for sale, so they got to make it perfect, right? For sale, and it has, doesn't look exactly like a gingerbread man, right? People are not going to buy it if his one arm. Whereas at home, people are just doing it for fun. So at home, they're going to do it more quickly. In the bakery, they're going to be very careful. And so here they're in the Rabban Gamliel's home. So home ones are okay, which is really interesting because in the previous one they said lo plug, we cannot make a distinction. Actually, maybe they did make a distinction, and they said it's particularly you bakers that we don't trust. People at home, if anything, we could trust better. All right, but there's another version of the story, which is the opposite. So no, they didn't. They weren't talking about baker's bread, but homemade bread. So the ones in Rabban Gamliel's house, they must have gotten from the bakery. And now, what's the difference? In the bakery, they have a set. They know how to do it, right? They have a system. They have experts, and they're going to be very careful. They're mass producing. The process is clear. Whereas at home, people are just trying it out. Let me try this. Let me try that, and they're gonna take too long, and then it will become leaven. So there's reasons on this side and on that side to say that one is permitted and one is not. Amar Rabbi Yosef, osin sirikin kimin rikikin, ve'en osin sirikin kimin gelus kaot. Rabbi Yosef says if they're very thin, then you can make them shapes, but if they're thick, then you should not, because the thick ones are more likely to become leaven, and so you have less wiggle room there. But if they're thin, you have a few more minutes, and you can make a quick shape, and that would be okay. All right, so that's the end of the second one. I mean, in the end, we actually connected the shape with the thickness of the bread as well.
Yeah, but Rabbi, didn't we say we're not allowed to do thick?
Yes. Oh yes, I mean, how could he say thick if you're making? Well, there was two opinions. Rav Huna said it's okay, although Rav Yosef questioned him. Doesn't say that Rav Huna ever agreed to that. Maybe Rav Huna said no, it doesn't matter. People can be careful. So that opinion still stands, even though Rav Yosef disagreed, and we had Rav Yirmiyah who gave a different opinion. So
it sounds like none of this was really like definitive. It sounds all very loose.
Well, there's
the entire sugya.
Yeah, there's different opinions. Rabbi Yosef is a Tana, so Rabbi Yosef comes before all of that, right? So he's Bet Hillel, Bet Shammai. Then Rabbi Yosef, talking about them, and so this whole the Amorim I'm coming after and commenting on it. So you can't say that anachronistically we shouldn't do that. So there were some who permitted these thick breads and some that didn't. Halakha l'maaseh, we don't make thick masot, or ones that are shaped. Okay, maybe kids would eat more masa if they were in fun shapes, but no, we can't do that. Okay, so now we get to the next topic, which will be the longest one, which is regarding Halah. The pasuk in במדבר says, "V'haya be'acholchem milechem haaretz tarimu terumah laHashem." When you eat lechem from the land, then you have to give a part of it, that dough, to the kohen. Only if it's a large dough, and has to be lechem. So it has to be baked in the normal way, which is usually baked in an oven. But what if it's pan-fried dough? Is that considered also lechem, and you have to give halah or not? Well, this is going to make a difference, and we're going to connect it to masa also, because if it is called lechem, then probably you'd say hamosi on it. And if it was made out of matzah, I mean, if it was not leaven, then it would be good for masa also. If it's not called lechem, then it's like cake. Then it could not be used for mitzvah. You would not have to bring Halah, and probably the beracha would be mizonot. We're not talking about the berachot here, but that would be certainly a related topic. Okay, so if you're wondering about bagels or mizonot or hamosi, it's going to be relevant in the discussion of this sugya. Okay, teno rabbanan. I try to stay away from controversial topics, but sometimes they come up. Hasuf ganin v'hadub shanin v'ha'es keritin v'halat hamasret v'hameduma peturin min hachala. Okay, so Baraita says that sufganin sounds familiar, right? Sufganiyot comes from the same thing. Sefog, it comes from the word sefog, which means sponge. It's a Greek word. That's actually the origin of the English word also. Sponge, you see, sufga, which is ironic that the food that we celebrate Chanukah with actually has a name that comes from the Greek. Anyway, this is some kind of pan-fried cake, or honey cakes, or spiced cakes. And this is when we're going to need the pan-fried halat hamasret. Masret is a pan. So challah in a pan, And also meduma. Meduma means something that tiruma fell into chulin. So it has some tiruma in it, more than 1 in 100. So therefore that can be eaten only by a kohen. Let's explain that one. All these are piturim min hachalah. You don't have to give halah. Well, the last one's easy to explain because since it's some tiruma only kohen could eat, fell in. So now, what are you going to do? Take challah and give it to a kohen? There's no need. This whole batch, it can only be eaten by a kohen because there's some teruma in it. Therefore, there's no need to take challah. You got to give the whole thing to the kohen. Okay, so that's good. Now, but here we have the pan fried. You don't have to bring challah. That would indicate that this is not called lechem, right? It has to be baked in an oven and fried bread. It would not be considered bread. My chalat hamasret, Amar Rabbi Yehuda Yoshua ben Levi, ze halut shel ba'ale batim. This is something that's fried or boiled in people's homes. Okay. All right. So Amar Resh Lakish, halalu maaseh ilpasen. Rabbi Yohanan amar maaseh ilpas chayavin, v'halalu shasa'an b'chama. So now we have a machloket between Resh Lakish and Rabbi Yohanan, the two Amoraim from Eretz Israel, about this. So although over here we said that it looks like pan fried is no good, Resh Lakish says that these are talking about things that are boiled, right, in a pot, and so therefore they are not bread, and you don't have to bring challah. However, Rabbi Yohanan has a different interpretation. He actually thinks that something that's baked in a pot or a pan, chayav, you do have to bring challah. And this baraita here, which is talking about chalat masret, that was actually when you leave it out in the sun. These are sun-baked. Sun-baked dough is not considered bread, and you don't have to bring challah. But pan-fried dough is considered bread, and you do have to bring challah. It would be hamosi. It is considered bread, and if it's not leaven, you can make masa out of it. Okay, so that's the fundamental machloket here. Resh Lakish says pan-fried is not bread. Don't have to bring challah. Rabbi Yohanan says it is bread. You do have to bring challah. We're going to see now two challenges to Resh Lakish. By the way, we're going to be talking about the minimum amount of baking that to be required bread. Like if you take it out too early, some people like their challah very raw. If you just bake it for a minute or two, is that considered bread? And then we'll see a challenge to Rabbi Yohanan. Okay, so let's see the first challenge to Resh Lakish. Resh Lakish again said that pan fried is not considered bread. Metibeh. הסופקנין והדובשנין והאס קיריטין, אסן בלפס חייבין, בחמה peturin, tiyubted Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. So here it's very clear. It's talking about these items, and you made them in an ilpas. Ilpas is also a Greek word. Lopas. This is a vessel that's used for cooking. And so if you make them in a pot or pan like this, then chayavin, you have to bring challah. So there you go. You have to bring challah. Resh Lakish, you said masel pas you don't have to bring challah. So clearly this is rejecting your opinion. But we'll try to save him. Amad Ulah, Amad lecha Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, Hachamaskinan, Shirtiach ulbasof hidbik. No, what we're talking about here is where you first heated the pot, and then you put the dough on the side. Because after all, that's the same as an oven. The way that they would bake bread in ovens in those days is they heat up the oven and they take the dough and stick it onto the side of the oven. And it would bake there. So it's actually from the heat of the wall rather than from the surrounding heat all around it. That's how it would bake. And so therefore, this baraita here that says that chayavin, it was talking about where you make the pan hot first, and then you put the dough onto the pan, onto the side of the pot, and that's how it gets hot. That's the same as an oven. When I said earlier that pan fried is okay, that was talking about the other way around. If I first put the dough in the pan and then put it on the fire, then it's going to be cooking, boiling, and that would be okay. So adetani sefa, that we question Resh Lakish's interpretation of that, because the Sefa here says, Bachama peturin, right? It's making a distinction. The Resha says if it's in a pot, chayavin. If you put it on the sun, peturin. Well, why would you go to such a far case? You should make a distinction within the first itself. Usually, when we want to show a contrast, we try to show the smallest possible contrast. This one is chayav, but one under, a little bit less, would be patur. So if you do this, this is chayav. It should say, this is only when you make the pan hot and then you stick it on. But if you put it on first and then made it hot, peturin. Why do you have to jump all the way to a more extreme case of hama? Then you know that for sure. Hama should be okay. So really, this reads much more smoothly according to the Yohanan. In fact, it does. But again, we can save the day for Resh Lakish. We can. I always wonder, does it mean you're actually adding the words? Sometimes it does. Here, it probably means you should read it as if these words were included. It's an interpretation. So you have the Resh says if you made it hot first, then it's no good. If you put the dough in first and then made it hot, you have to add those words in, then it's like baking it in the sun, and that's okay. Then it's not, that dough is not considered baked. Okay, not considered bread. All right, so that was the first challenge to Resh Lakish, which he was able to resolve, and now the second one. Tashema yosin b'masa hina b'masa ha'asuya be'ilpas. On Pesach, you are allowed to use masa that was hina, that means half baked. The word na means raw, so hina may be related to that. So half baked masa is okay. That's considered bread. It's considered, if it's masa, it's considered masa, and it's considered baked, and that's okay. Also, if you made it in a pot. So there you go. A pot is considered masa. If it's considered masa, that means it's lechem, and it should be chayav to bring Halah. Okay, so that's also a question on Resh Lakish, because he said that it's not considered bread. It's just like a pancake or a cake. So Resh Lakish could answer here also. This is talking about when you made the pot hot first and then you stuck it on the wall. Then I agree. Then that's called baking, because that's similar to being in an oven. Okay, good. So that answer's fine. But now that you mentioned this masahina, that's really interesting. What does that mean? What's the definition of half-baked? How baked does something have to be considered that, okay, now it's bread. Now you would say hamosi. Now it's considered masa, and you can use it. This is actually very important, because if you bake something too little, right, you bake it just for a few seconds, take it out of the oven, it still can rise, right? At what point do you say it won't rise anymore? Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shemuel, Kol sheporsa ve'en chotin nimshachin hemena. Definition is anytime you break it and the strings will not come from it. If you take raw dough and break it apart, right, it doesn't break apart easily. You have the dough gets smaller and smaller until it's just it's strings, and doesn't do that. If you take a piece of pita and rip it, right, you'll get a nice clean break. So that has to be enough for that. I'm thinking about some of the halot that we buy for Friday night. You break them and it's kind of stringy, right? So that people like some people like their halot to be undercooked, even today. Okay, so that is the definition of hina. As long as it makes a clean break, then that's considered bread, even if it's undercooked. Amarava v'chen lachme toda. He says also lachme toda. When someone brings a korban toda, they're thankful about something. They also bring 40 loaves of different kinds, 10 of each. One set of the 10 have to be masa, and so that he says it's true there also that it can be cooked. It can be half baked as long as it fits this definition. Pishita, hacha lechem ketiv, hacha lechem ketiv. Rava, what are you teaching us? Obvious, isn't that obvious? It says it has to be made out of bread. So there you go. Those are bread. So what do you need to tell me that for? Okay. Mahu detema ho'il uchtib hikrib mimenu echad mikol korban. Echad shelo yitel parus. Okay, he's telling us the chidush is that when you make the 40 loaves, one out of each set of 10 he gives to the kohen, the owner. It will give 4 out of the 40 to the kohen, one of each type. And so over there it says echad mikol korban. He has to give one of each. So if it says one, I might think that one means that shelo yitol parus has to be something whole. I can't give him 2 halves or pieces. I have to give him a whole loaf. And in the case when it's half baked, I might have thought, it comes apart easily. When it's not only half baked, it doesn't stick together well. And so I might have thought that it's not good enough. It has to be fully cooked in order to be considered a whole loaf. And therefore, Rabbah is coming to teach us, even if it's only half baked and it's still kind of doughy inside, as long as it does make a clean break, that's fine, even though it doesn't hold together as well as if it was fully cooked. All right, so that's what he was teaching us. Okay, very good. So that's about the about the half baked. So you can make pretty raw masa. Maybe it's going to be a little softer if it's not cooked to a crisp. But now we have the last question on the Rabbi Yohanan. Metibe hame'isa bet shamai poterin ubet hillel mechayevin. You have dough that's boiled in water, and so bet shamai says, no, you don't have to bring challah. It's not considered bread. Bet Hillel says it is considered bread. All right. Chalita bet Shammai mechayevin bet Hillel potrin. However, chalita, which is also kind of means boiled, some kind of another kind of boiling, there bet Shammai says chayav and bet Hillel says patur. So we have to define what me'isa and what chalita is. For whatever reason, bet Shammai here is actually more mekel, which is unusual, and Bet Hillel is machmir, and here the other way around. Truth is not really mekel or machmir, because if you say it's true, you don't have to bring challah, but then that also has other consequences about whether it's considered bread for other things. Okay, so that's we have 2 opinions about each of these. Ezehu me'isa, ezehu chalita. What is the definition of these? Me'isa kemach shal gabe muglashin. Halita muglashin shal gabe kemach. So the word me'isa is when you take the dough and you put it into boiling water. You take the flour, put it into boiling water. Whereas halita is the opposite. You take the boiling water and you put it on the flour. So this makes a difference in the outcome, and there's machloket each way. That's 2 opinions. Rabbi Ishmael Rabbi Yosef Omer mishum aviv zeva zeh liftor. So Rabbi Ishmael says no. Both types of boiling are is okay, is not considered bread, and you don't have to bring challah. Another version of Rabbi Ishmael Rabbi Yosef, Amdila zeva zeh lechayuv. Both of them you have to bring them. Okay, so now we have so far 4 opinions in every possibility, right? We have 2 types of boiling, putting the flour first or the hot water first. And either they're both okay, both not good, or one's good and one's not, or the other one's good and this one's not. Okay, so any possibility is there, and yet there's a 5th possibility here. They say it doesn't matter what it is, it only depends on how you're preparing it. If it's done in a pot, then it's not bread. If it's done in an oven, then it is considered bread. Okay, so those are the 5 opinions. Now, Vetanakama, Maishana Me'isa, Maishana Halita. So according to the first opinions here, what is the difference between them? Why should it make a difference if the flour is first or second? Rav Yehuda, there's a problem here, because it says, Rav Yehuda said the name of Shemuel, and then it says also, Rabbi Yehuda said, who's Rabbi Yehuda? And some say Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. This word Rabbi Yehuda, if you look in the manuscripts, right? Okay, in the Vilna Shas, it actually says Rav Yehuda. However, in the first printing and most of the manuscripts says Resh Chupchik is actually Rabbi. Most of them say Rabbi, and some say Rav. So Rabbi has to be correct, which actually they corrected in this Steinsaltz edition. If you say Rav Yehuda, it makes no sense, because Amar Rav Yehuda in the name of Shemuel, and also Rav Yehuda said, that's the same person twice. So it has to be Rabbi Yehuda, which would be a different person. So there's 3 possibilities of who said this. Okay, in any case, what did they say? Kemachloket bazo, kach machloket bezo. Vetabra, mi sheshana zo, lo shana zo. It says, the truth is, you have a good question. It doesn't make a difference if the flour it comes first or the boiling water comes first. And so this machloket is all the same. Wherever you'd say one you'd say with the other. So v'tavra means we have to break it apart. There's actually two separate sections. They're not talking about that this is not continuous, but rather two different sources. And whoever said the first one did not say the second. So it's actually a machloket. Meisa and chalita are the same thing. The point is it's flour that's boiled. One opinion says Bet Shammai is patur and Bet Hillel is chayav. Second opinion says Bet Shammai is chayav and Bet Hillel is patur. So there you go. That's two opinions, and then you have the rest. And the Bishmael says both this way, both that way, and so on. Okay, so in the end, it doesn't make a difference which one you bring first. Anyway, what's the point for us? Katani mihat, chachamim omerim, echad ze, ve'echad ze, sha'asan bilpas patur, betanur chayav. What interests us is the last opinion. That's of chachamim. That's the majority opinion. And it says ilpas. If you cook it, if you fry the dough in a pan or in a pot, patur, you don't have to bring Halah. This is a challenge to Rabbi Yohanan, because he said that pan-fried dough is considered bread. All right, so tiyubta de Rabbi Yohanan. All right, so how is Rabbi Yohanan going to answer the challenge from that baraita? Amalecha Rabbi Yohanan, he could say to you, Tanaehi, Titanya. He says, he could say it's machloket Tanaim. It's true that Chachamim here say it's patur, but we follow a different baraita. And here's a different baraita that shows that it's actually machloket. Right. The earlier opinions here weren't talking about pots. They were just talking about, which one you put in first. So they're not relevant for us. Only this one is relevant. And there's only one opinion in this baraita, but the next baraita has more opinions. Sorry, I went too far. Here, Detanya. Yachol yehem me'isa v'chaluta chayavin b'chala tamodomad lechem. It's wondering, can it be that if you boil the dough, then you have to bring challah? It would be called bread? No, that's why it says lechem. Lechem means oven baked. That's the typical form, and therefore it's not considered bread. That's the first opinion. Rabbi Yehuda omer en lechem ela afui betanur. He says, no, bread is only what's in an oven. Now, these actually look like they're saying the same thing, right? The first opinion said boiled is not bread because it says the word lechem. Okay, so boiled is out. Then Rabbi Yehuda says only in an oven. Isn't that the same thing as saying boiled is out? If you say only in an oven it's considered bread. Rabbi Yehuda, Hainu Tanakama, the Gemara wonders that they're saying the same opinion. Oh, so it must be there is a difference between them, and that is if it's pan-fried. Tanakama sabar masel pas chayavin. Rabbi Yehuda sabar masel pas peturin. Okay, so according to Tanakama, he's talking about boiled, and that would be out. But if it was pan-fried, then it would be called bread. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda is more specific, and he says only in an oven is considered bread, not anything else. And pan-fried would be out. And so Rabbi Yehuda says, so the Rabbi Yohanan can say, I'm following Tanakama here. And that's why I say it is considered bread. Okay, so that's how Rabbi Yohanan responded and defended himself. Now we're going to challenge him again. We say we don't have to interpret it that way, even this baraita. Lo, tekula amama sel pas peturin. No, maybe everyone agrees, Tanakama and Rabbi Yehuda, that you don't have to, that pan-fried is not considered bread. They're talking about if you put it back in the oven to cook more. In other words, if you boil it first and then you bake it, this is really bagels, right? Then Tanakama Sabar, if you go and it's true you boiled it, but then you baked it, that's called bread. You say Amosei on it. Rabbi Yehuda Sabar en lechem ela afui betanur meikara. Rabbi Yehuda says it has to be in the oven the whole time. If you did anything else during the process, if you fried it or boiled it during the process, no good. It has to be only baked in an oven. And since you boiled it first, it's not considered bread. In other words, he would say mizonot on bagels. Okay. So because he has in this interpretation, which is according to this interpretation, if it's only a pan fried, according to all opinions, it would be not considered bread. And so now this would be again a challenge to the Yohanan. Okay, now we'll try to answer it again. Amar Rava, my tamad Rabbi Yehuda dichtib ba'afu eser nashim lachmechem betanur echad. I'm not going to answer it again. Rava is just giving an explanation. Why did Rabbi Yehuda say only in an oven? Because it's pasuk in Vayikra. This is in the Berachot and Kalalot at the end of in Bechukotai, and there it says the situation is going to be so dire, going to be such poverty that 10 women will have to use one oven because there's going to be so little fuel, so little resources. You're going to have to 10 people will have to share one oven. Anyway, his point is lechem ahafui betanur echad karui lechem v'shen ahafui betanur echad en karui lechem. Since it's tanur echad, meaning only oven, one oven. Yeah, so it's called lechem only if it's baked in an oven and not in anything else. Okay, interesting pasuk to learn a halacha from the Kilalot. But anyway, that would be his source, that it has to be baked in an oven only. Okay, according to this interpretation, it would be in fact a challenge to the Yohanan, because the Yohanan is not following the majority opinion. But the Yohanan could interpret it as he did before. That would interpret this as a machloket between Tanakama and the Yohanan. All right, so in the end, we don't have a proof either way. For or against. We tried 2 challenges against Rabbi Yohanan, but answered them. We tried a challenge to Rabbi Yohanan, but that was not conclusive either. And now we'll end with a story. In the story we have Yateb Rabbah v'Rab Yosef achoreh de Rabbi Zeira. The way it worked in those days is that the teacher would be sitting in the front, and the best students were in the first row. The second students in the second row. The worst students were in the last row. Right. So if you remember the famous story about Moshe Rabbeinu sitting in the back row of Rabbi Akiva's classroom. Right. You have to, that makes it's more interesting when you realize this. If someone asked a good question, they'd be promoted in a good row. If someone didn't know the answer, they'd have to be put in the back row. Okay. Anyway, Yetev Rabbah Rabbi Yosef. So they were sitting behind Rabbi Zeira. They were in the second row. Rabbi Zeira was in the first row. Yetev Rabbi Zeira kameh de Ulah, and he was sitting in the first row, right in front of the teacher, who was Ulah. Amar le Rabbah Rabbi Zeira, ba'amineh me'Ulah. So the person in the second row, Rabbah, he wouldn't ask a question directly. He was too shy to ask a question directly to Ulah. So he's poking the guy in front of him, right, and saying, "Hey, go ask this question. Ask Ulah this question. What's the question? What if you take the dough and you put it on the inside of the pot and the fire on the outside of the pot? The way we would usually use a frying pan. The heat is on the opposite side of where you put the dough. Ask him that. Ask him if that's considered, is that considered baking or frying? Amale, my emale. What am I going to tell him? Di aminale, amali he nihu masel pas. That's a dumb question. He's going to tell me back. That's the typical case of something that's pan fried. So I'm not going to ask him that question, right? That's obvious. That's the whole discussion we've had before, is about exactly that case. All right. So now, Amar le Rav Yosef le Rabbi Zeira. So that was the first one. Was Rabbah said. There's 2 rabbis that are sitting in the back row, right? Rabbah and Rav Yosef. So Rabbah said that one he wouldn't do it. Rav Yosef, the other rabbi in the back row, tells Rabbi Zeira, ask him the other way around. What if you put the dough on one side of the pan, and then you put that like kind of like broiled, where you put the fire on top, and it would heat directly down on the same side of the pan where the dough is. Well, what about that? Amale, my emale. Why should I ask him that? Di aminale, amarli, rov aniyim osin ken. I know he's going to answer. He's going to say, poor people generally cook in that way. I guess it conserves energy to put the fire there directly on it, and therefore, since poor people do it, it's a typical way that many people cook in that method, and that's also called the same maaseh pas. In other words, it's not going to make a difference if you cook it on this side or on that side. They're all considered the same thing, and so therefore he wouldn't even ask the question. I just like the scene of the students in the back. Ask him this. I'm not asking him that. It's a dumb question, and in the end they don't. But we have the answer anyway from Rabbi Zeira himself. So therefore, it does not matter which side of the pan we cook it on. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen ve'amen.